Hi, everyone. Brian here. Just a little disclaimer before we jump into this episode. The Juraj Slafkovsky contract extension, which should, in theory, have kicked off this episode, only got announced about halfway through our recording. And therefore, we only get to it at about the 40-minute mark when Jordan noticed on Twitter that the news had dropped. So please stick around for that. Before then, we talk about all the picks that the Montreal Canadiens have made. We do a deep dive on Michael Hage, a little bit more on Demidov, talk about Aatos, Koivu, and everybody else that Habs picked in this year's draft. And then we talk about some other off-season important stuff later on in the episode as well. So stick around, and thank you so much for listening.
Welcome to This Week in Habsland. I'm Jordan, he is Brian, and we're here today to give our full review and recap of everything at the draft as it pertains to the Montreal Canadiens and touch on some early free agent news that have happened. Really not much with the Habs thus far. Some housekeeping notes. If you haven't yet, go back and listen to our not one but two draft night episodes. We had a lot of fun, about an hour and a half across the two episodes. In terms of news, we are recording this at around 3:20 p.m. on Canada Day. So if some extra news in terms of, related to the Montreal Canadiens breaks, we'll do our best to cover it. But for the time being, it feels like the Habs are not really taking part in day one of free agency. And then final housekeeping is this will be our last episode for a few weeks. We'll be back with at least one more episode in the off season to kind of fully recap and reimagine what the Montreal Canadiens are going forward. So I think we'll wait, Brian, probably until hopefully there's a Slafkovsky extension or a Goulet extension or at least the Xhekaj contract. So we're thinking probably late July before we come back for what would be our final episode of the offseason. But for now, we're going to take a step back again, go back to draft night. And now that we've had a bit more time to digest it, Brian, the Habs had drafted Ivan Demidov and Michael Hage in the first round. I've had some extra time now, I'm sure you have had too, to look at both players with a little bit more detail. Is there anything else that we missed on draft night that you wanted to touch on with either player?
I feel as though with Demidov, we've done a lot.
Yeah.
We've talked about him for months at this point. But with Michael Hage, he was not necessarily on our radar because we both felt as though at 26, we're not going to get him. We're not going to see him there. He's going to go much higher. And I thought probably higher than 21. So I want to talk a bunch about Michael Hage here. We talked about the character stuff and where he comes from and his parents being Habs fans and him growing up as a Habs fan, and that's great. But on him as a hockey player, Hage, he's a play-driving, 200-foot, smart and skilled centerman. And his ceiling is far too high for him to have gone at 21. At least that's the way I see it. He sustained an upper body injury in his first practice of the 22-23 season with the Chicago Steel in the USHL, which delayed his development. But his ability to get back on the horse really impressed me. He finished that season with 5 goals, 5 assists in 13 games, and then he steadily improved during this past season. He worked on his playmaking, he worked on his defense, his checking, his transition game, and he got results on offense. And those results, those offensive results, culminated in an incredible run to close out the year, which he and Demidov actually had in common. I saw a tweet from @NotDeej on X that made me leap out of my chair with joy, where @NotDeej searched on the Elite Prospects draft eligible players list for the most points by a draft eligible player in the final 25 games of their season. At the literal top of the list, number 1 and number 2 are Ivan Demidov and Michael Hage. Not Celebrini, not Catton, not Lindstrom or Seneca, but Demidov and Hage. So when we talk about Hage's high ceiling, that's the Michael Hage that we're referring to. The one who outscored everybody except Demidov in the back part of last season. And by the way, that's all the ceiling stuff. His floor is great too. He's a defensively responsible center. In the future, he should absolutely be able to match up against tough trios and be effective in all 3 zones. And then the last thing that I'll throw in here about him, his agility is awesome. We saw that at the Combine. He placed 5th in pro agility on the left-hand side. And then he had a bunch of top 20 finishes, a lot of them in pull-ups and things that require upper body strength. So anybody who's worrying about what I mentioned earlier, the upper body injury that he sustained, doing that well in the Combine in a bunch of strength-related upper body exercises is a great sign that that's not a lingering injury.
I think one part that's important to note on top of the fact that he finished so strong is that he was on a pretty average Chicago Steel team. They were not one of the powerhouses in the USHL this past season, and they were therefore pretty reliant on Michael Hage to create stuff. And I think talking more about the player, there's really no fatal flaw in his game. Like, we're going to get to the players that the Canadiens picked on day 2, and almost all of them have one element of their game where you look at and you're like, oh man, like if that doesn't get better, I don't see a path to the NHL. With Hage, there's no fatal flaw. There's nothing, even saying anything is average, I think might even be pushing it. What he does really well in the games that I've been able to watch, I was able to watch 2.5 games since the draft night. I think he does a really good job of blending his skating skill with his shooting and his passing. Off the rush is the easiest place to notice it and where he is really good at it. In terms of cycle chances, like that is a part where, or maybe just like creating chances off the cycle, like he's little limited there in terms of how creative he can be with it. And I think he would probably need to develop better puck possession skills in the offensive zone, and that can come with increased physicality, which appears to have gotten better throughout the course of his draft eligible season. But so like that's like one part where he might be a little limited. The other is he's a little bit more reactive to offensive situations developing in front of him rather than proactive and intentionally manipulating defenders with his eyes, with his body, with his stick to get his teammates in open spaces. Now, again, how much of that is he just wasn't really on a good team, and going to the University of Michigan next season, he'll be able to do so much more. Like that's something that's gonna be really interesting to see. But that's another part where it's like his processing on the offensive side, and maybe that just means full time he's not a center, projecting out 3, 4, 5 years. I still think like on the boards, he would probably have to get a little bit stronger to really pull through and become at least a second line winger. But we're looking at a player that has really strong puck skills to a certain extent. He loves to deke. I mean, it's obviously no Ivan Demidov here, but he's fairly good at stick handling, especially through the neutral zone into the offensive zone. He is someone who, just watching him, it was like, oh, he's like, we were talking about on the draft night episodes. Okay, well, power play 1, we think we might have figured out. And power play 2 would likely have like a Logan Mailloux and Kirby Dach. I think Michael Hage walks right into that spot. And he's the player now who, if the Canadiens are somehow still using the drop pass, it would be to Michael Hage, I think, at this point, because he is so good off the rush. And that's one thing that kind of just clicked in my mind of, oh, I think he could do that almost right away coming into the NHL.
For sure.
So there's a lot of stuff there. And in terms of the weaknesses, it's really just the creativity in the offensive zone, being able to play make at a high level. But I think there's an ability there to grow, especially if we're all going to assume at least 2 years at Michigan. But that's what I'm seeing. Like, I'm really excited. Going through all this tape in the past few days, like it got me really interested and excited about his development and kind of parsing through what happened to him over the past couple seasons. Obviously, like the tragedy that he had to endure a year ago and how that absolutely affected him at the early onset of the season. And I think the Canadiens are a perfect fit for him. There's just, I think, a lot of positives with him, and just still full marks as it was on draft night for Michael Hage.
Of course. And I want to address one thing that you were mentioning, his less than ideal playmaking in the offensive zone. What I saw a lot of was a huge quantity of slot passes, but not a huge amount of connection. And I do want to draw a link between the players he's passing to and that sort of discrepancy. Because as he goes to Michigan next year and plays with better players who will be able to get away from a defender, push off, find open space, I think that the success of his slot passes is going to increase tremendously as those players are able to get into open areas so he can feed them the puck for one-timers, for tap-ins, all that type of stuff, because he tried it all of the time. It just didn't work all of the time. That aspect of it, I think, is very interesting, because if that can grow with better players and he can get used to playing with better players and feeding them in the slot, like that's one part of his game that can increase like crazy, right? And like you said, he's not weak in any other aspect. The only thing that I'll use the elite prospects numbering model, the attribute ratings, the only thing that was average was his physicality. And he's a big dude that as he fills out and learns to battle along the boards, that physicality is just going to get better. His shooting's above average, his skating, passing, puck handling, his hockey sense, all the other attributes were above average. So this to me is absolutely a steal. A guy with this level of intelligence at 21 who closed out the year so well. I think that if his entire season had been at that level, we would not have seen him at 21. Hughes would have had to trade up a bunch more spots to even get a chance at him. And obviously, like you said, a lot of that is tied to the tragedy of his father's passing. And so all that we hope for Michael Hage basically is that all of these really positive attributes keep growing, and that the next 2 seasons, we see the flash of the last part of the season throughout. We see some consistency with him, because if we do, top 6 player, no doubt. And like I said earlier, his floor is so solid that at worst, 3rd line center or winger, which we will absolutely take with a 21st overall pick.
Absolutely. And I think there's been reporting that the Habs are actually trying to move up again from the 21 spot, specifically to get Michael Hage, because they weren't entirely sure if he was going to be there sitting at 21 when they made their own pick. Moving on from Hage, one last turn for now to Ivan Demidov. You were speaking earlier about like passing, puck handling, hockey sense when talking about Michael Hage, and saying like, hey, it's all pretty good. It's all projecting as above average. Well, my friend, those 3 things for Ivan Demidov, they project at what, nothing less than an all-star level? Not that like being an all-star holds much weight really in the NHL these days, but in watching more tape of Demidov, what I kind of found really noticeable was how he tries to make the extra special play, which for me really speaks to his vision and hockey sense, right? So like initially it was the dangles I found that was like the most impressive part about his game, but I really do think with more repeated viewings, it's actually the hockey sense combined with the puck skills that will make him the difference maker. It's not someone that's just going to dangle through everybody just for the sake of dangling. Although, again, sometimes I do legitimately think he was bored last season in the MHL. But I really do think it's a combination of he does it for a purpose. And we talked about it last episode with the 10-2 stance. Like, it's not just to do it for the sake of doing it. Like, there's always a purpose to his movements. So when you combine that level of puck handling and passing ability, like so crucial that he's not just a puck hog, but the ability to make the passes, and then you blend that with the hockey sense and then, a decent shot, not, top tier level, but it's still a pretty good shot. It just gets you more and more excited about him. It appears that next year he'll be playing in the KHL, which I think would be ideal for his development. Yeah. So that was my extra little tidbit on Demidov since Friday night, where we were so giddy and excited about it. Kind of taking a look at it again, it was just those things jumped off the video even more.
For sure. You're absolutely right, Jordan. His unique attribute is not only the puck handling, it's definitely the hockey sense influencing the puck handling, where he's always finding and attempting a play that nobody on the opposition is expecting. It's always something unique and dangerous, and the real test is going to be at higher levels, like you said, the KHL and then the NHL, hopefully after next season, as early as the 2025-2026 season. And that'll be a big test for him, because like we said on the previous episode, the competition in the MHL, not as good. The competition in the KHL, much better. Smarter coaching, smarter defensive systems that he's going to have to be smarter than. But I will say this going in, I think he's more than intelligent enough to figure them all out within the first several seconds of the game. Oh, they're playing this defensive system? Oh, okay, all right. I know what to do.
Any additional thoughts on the future line combinations? Because thinking about it more and more, I thought Slafkovsky, Suzuki, Demidov made the most sense. And at this point, Nick Suzuki just becomes a 40-goal scorer. Because I think Suzuki realized this past season with Slaf that he doesn't always have to be the person setting people up.
Yeah.
And like with both Slafkovsky and Demidov, I mean, Suzuki doesn't even have to be the main playmaker anymore. Quite frankly, if you're looking at the 3 of them, if you're ranking playmaking abilities between Slafkovsky, Suzuki, and Demidov is, again, give him till he's age 20, but going to probably be the best of the 3. And then it's like debatable. I mean, we could have had this conversation this past season, like who's the better playmaker between Slafkovsky and Suzuki. There's definitely chemistry there that enhances both of their abilities. But there's a universe where in 3 years, Nick Suzuki is scoring 43 goals because everyone's setting him up, which is already what started happening this past season and how Nick eclipsed 30 goals. So any extra thoughts on the permutations of the top 6?
Well, with those 3, I mean, you're talking about playmaking, like who might be the best playmaker at that point. And I want to talk about shooting, because they're all great shooters, but in different ways. Slafkovsky has the power, that one-timer, that as he gets more surgical and precise with it, that's going to start to go in a lot more off of that right half wall, especially on the power play, I think. Suzuki is far more selective with it, where often, again, on the power play, he would curl back behind the blue line, wait for a pass, and then unleash a wrister. Whereas Demidov has a really good sort of curl and drag wrister that always seems to find a hole in the goalie. But more importantly, he always is using the defender as a screen. He's got that Ovechkin thing of the curl and drag and using the defender's legs and body to screen the goaltender. So in terms of shooters, they've all got it. In terms of playmaking, they've all got it. Hands, Demidov wins that, no doubt. In terms of physicality, it's definitely Slafkovsky. And then defensive acumen, Suzuki's a gem. So like if that's your number one line, there's no reason that that's not a top end number one line in the entire NHL. I don't care that Nick Suzuki is not a perpetual 100-point scorer, although he might be with these guys. What I care about is the fact that in all three zones, this line is going to be fantastic, assuming they're put together, right? Like that's the caveat here. If Doc or Caulfield or Hage or Roy or somebody else that's traded for or signed next year in free agency makes a push for the top line, or one of these guys moves down or something, fair enough. But if this is the top line, I will be ecstatic, despite how many times I've said that Suzuki, Slafkovsky, Caulfield is my favorite thing in the world. So despite that being just a terrific trio and a really fun one to watch, this iteration would be really cool too. And it would also mean that Caulfield would face off against the best defensive line less often. And I think that for a guy his size who has to find space, that's beneficial to Caulfield as well. So there's nothing wrong with that. And then obviously the advanced analytics of Doc and Caulfield have been great in the little time they've been put together. So man, oh man, I'm on cloud nine, Jordan. I have been for days. Like last season with Reinbacher, it took me a night. I had to sleep on it. And then the next day I woke up and I was like, yeah, this is great. They made a great pick here. Whereas from the get-go, I was in disbelief. And then I'm on a rise right now where every day I keep seeing something different with Demidov and thinking about the future and the power play and all these things and how cool this could be.
Absolutely. Look, it was fairly unanimous across the board, the Montreal Canadiens. I know we did our own winners and losers of night one of the draft, and we didn't include the Habs in it because it was so obvious they were a winner. And it was nice to see basically every single media outlet put the Habs at, an A+ winner of the draft. With part of it with Demidov obviously falling to number 5, if we can't phrase it any other way, and then grabbing Michael Hage too, a player who I think is undervalued, despite the fact that he ended up being picked where he was mocked. That is a player that I do think immediately has better value. So look, day one of the draft, all thumbs up, very excited, really, really, I think and we'll talk about state of the franchise in a few weeks when they hopefully settle a few contracts and maybe move another defenseman. But the Demidov pick, that entire night, I think really shifted how Hughes and Gordon are approaching the team building now long-term, because a big piece was filled, 2 pieces, quite frankly. And then on the following day, the Canadiens had a whole heck of a lot of picks, none in the second round, but I believe they made 8 additional draft picks on day 2, Brian. Let me ask you this question. We talk about patterns with Kent Hughes and Jeff Gordon with regards to their draft. We've mentioned it over and over again now that like they tend to favor Europeans in the first round, and they've tended to consolidate draft picks. They still did this past draft. With regards to the players that they picked, you can include the day 1 players as well if you want, or just reserve it to the day 2 players. Did you find any patterns this year in their draft picks?
I noticed a few things. The first thing I noticed, and maybe the least important, but the first thing that I happened to notice was them drafting 7 forwards, 2 or 3 centers, depending on how Ben Merrill develops, because he's also played a lot of right wing. They then drafted 2 left defensemen and a goalie. And then another 7-3 split. Something else I noticed was the draft year players versus the D+1 players. They're not afraid of picking players who were eligible last season, didn't get picked, but then made a giant leap in their development this year, and who they see having more value at 19 than maybe they did at 18. So those guys being Thorpe, Kanin, and Bergqvist, and I hope I'm pronouncing those right. But the biggest pattern that I saw overall, or trend, is that the Canadiens did not pick a single player under 6 feet tall. Now, picking for size, obviously this year was not a Habs-only thing, right? As only 3 players under 5'10" were drafted by an NHL club altogether in the whole draft. But certainly the Canadiens saw size as a factor in their drafting. They took it one step further than some other NHL teams, with all of their picks being 6 feet or taller. They had 3 6-foot players, 1 guy at 6'1", 1 guy at 6'2", 1 guy at 6'3", and then 2 players at 6'4".
Yeah, that was by far and away, I think the main theme of day 2. When you draft a guy like Tyler Thorpe, who's 6'5", 215, over age or whatever. He has an NHL shot and he's gigantic. Might as well take a flyer on him. So I kind of did like how, and blending, like really what I saw was, okay, they're definitely going after forwards. I know they drafted 3 other players, but really it was forwards with size and one like big deficiency. Like, so they were taking some swings, right? Whether it was like Tyler Thorpe, whether it was Ben Merrill, like they were taking swings on players. I mean, we're burying the lead a little bit with Aatos Koivu, but him too, in a way where, obviously we're going to get to him. Don't worry, people. We're going to get to Aatos. They're betting on guys who have a big deficiency. Usually it's skating. For the most part here, it was skating. Obviously, right, when you're drafting bigger players, physicality is not going to be too much of a worry. The NHL shots seem to be around for most of these guys at least an average level or slightly above average, it seemed like. The skating seemed to be the big worry, but that's what I want to know. Like, is there something we don't know about, like, the Canadiens' confidence in players being able to develop into better skaters? Like, that was one thing that everybody they kept drafting. It was like, well, you know, like, this guy's not that much of a good skater, or like, oh boy, he's really going to have to work on it. And that goes true with the defensemen as well. But yeah, so that was the pattern. Big guys, swings on the forward end. I would have liked to have seen some swings on the defensive end because, you know, why not? Like, if we're gonna draft big guys on the forward side, like I know like Owen Protz is like, he kind of became a bit of I think he's already becoming a cult hero because of some of the terminology that elite prospects used on him, which I'm sure we'll get into in a moment. I would have liked to see a few more swings on the defensive end, really. But that's kind of what I saw.
Yeah, well, in terms of swings, like the biggest holes in our organization coming into the draft had to be, number one is high skill forwards, which they attacked beautifully by picking Demidov and Hage on day 1. And then they got a bunch of, or a few high upside forwards on day 2 that need to work out specific details, often the skating, like you said. Number 2, size up front. So they definitely dealt with that. We've addressed that already. And then the third thing, which they did not address, is depth at right-hand defense. So that's been the thing for a few years. Now, getting Reinbacher, Mailloux coming into the fold and being better, Barron being tendered his qualifying offer, makes this less of an important hole, let's say, but a hole nonetheless. But I am absolutely happy that they dealt with the first 2 things.
Yeah.
And then on the topic of Koivu, because I want to get into Aatos, I'm ready. The story is fantastic, but I think everybody sort of knows the story. So why don't we get into his game?
Yeah. He is a responsible center with a very late birth date who has gotten better and better over the course of the year. So yet another late riser. Maybe that's becoming a bit of a pattern, quite frankly, with some of the Montreal Canadiens draft picks we saw. Projectability is definitely there as a defensive center. Offensively, it appears that he is kind of limited right now to just power play only production. That at 5-on-5, and that again, I think this one too comes down to skating. Like, in terms of the Canadiens drafted quite a few poor skaters in this draft. Koivu is not the worst of them. He might be the most average among them. Again, taking out the day 1 guys, obviously. So, skating has to improve, and then maybe you'll start seeing some development at 5-on-5 offensively for him. But he's a European player, so you get 4 years of development. So I'm not too overly concerned about him. But yeah, he's a big body center who needs to fill into his frame and get better at skating so that he can produce offensively at 5-on-5. But offensively, I don't think there's much of a path to being elite. So you're looking at a bottom 6 center most likely.
Which, hey, that's okay at the 70th pick. If your guy gets there, that's great. So the skating, to me, it's a technical thing rather than a physical thing, because he is a physical specimen. Aatos Koivu placed in the top 10 of the NHL Combine in 5 different categories. So he was 8th in VO2 max, so basically the volume of oxygen. It's an aerobic fitness test. It measures the capacity of your cardiovascular and your respiratory system supplying oxygen to your muscles, so how well it does that. He was 8th in the standing long jump, 6th in the no arm jump, 5th in mean power output on the Wingate test, that stationary bike test measuring, the power of your legs, the one that Slafkovsky broke the machine in his combine, and he placed 2nd in squat jump. So like all of these either have to do with your cardiovascular system, your respiratory system, or with the strength of your legs. And so Aatos Koivu has the physicality, right? That we see that very clearly with this. He has the drive, the character. Like we know he's going to have incredible character. He's Saku's son. We know that he's a beast in terms of these physical attributes. And I want to tell you one more thing. Aatos Koivu is a threateningly good sniper. His one-timer is very heavy, it's precise, and he's also really good in the net front position. He finds pucks, he smacks them in. So, like you said, Jordan, perhaps a bottom six, maybe fourth line role is more the style of player that Koivu would be. But does he have power play upside? I think absolutely with that shot. Can his smarts improve and then he can produce at 5-on-5 as well? I think absolutely. There's no doubt in my mind that he's going to work really hard. So, the fact that he's a late bloomer also means to me that this might be the tip of the iceberg. We may not see all that he has to offer, and he's got something of a late birthday. Not super late, but certainly later than most players in this draft. So I'm super into this pick. I mean, the obvious reason being he's the son of the most beloved Montreal Canadiens captain of my lifetime. But his physical abilities, his drive to succeed, and his sniping abilities, I think are putting him on another tier for me of happiness.
Agreed. Everyone was happy about this pick. I think obviously there's a sentimental reason about it, but I think there's it's a really smart and good flyer to take on a player. When you look at this team down the middle, they have centers, top six and bottom six, especially if you're including Hage now as a potential middle six center. Taking a flyer on Aatos Koivu is really good to do. I just really like the pick. Other draft picks that the Habs made, we don't have to get into all of them, Brian. I did mention Owen Protz earlier. So he's a 6'1" defenseman playing out of the OHL in Brantford. By the way, Brantford Bulldogs, it's still weird to call a team any other than Hamilton, the Bulldogs. I know Belleville had the Bulldogs for a bit, and now it's Brantford and it's only temporary that it's Brantford. It's going to go back to being Hamilton in a couple of years. It's very weird. So here's the line that I mentioned earlier that elite prospects use. So one was the most violent player on the ice at any given time. And then the really fun one was, quote, he has a monopoly on violence, smart violence, end quote. So he likes to hit people and hit them very, very hard. I think defensively, he's showing a lot of projectability as a stay-at-home, maybe not quite shut down defenseman, but definitely a stay-at-home bottom pair. Maybe you can squeeze into the fourth spot defensive player, ideally some penalty kill. There's really not much there offensively, and it could be perceived as a weakness, but there's something there. I think it's another fun player to kind of track for the next couple years, and would not be surprised if he spends a few years in Laval if all goes right for him, and take your time on this development. This is what I talked about in the last episode. When they drafted Hage, I was like, cool, they got a guy that's going to need a couple years and of runway to develop. I think they did the same thing, whether it was with Koivu or with Protz or with some other players, the non-overagers, of we're going to be able to take our time with a lot of these guys. Some of them are European, so we have rights for 4 years. Others, like Protz, I think would be a nice development through the end of their junior career and potentially into Laval. So that was one player. I don't know if you have anything you want to say on Protz, Brian, or if you wanted to tackle one or two other players before we wrap up the draft coverage.
So yeah, I think you basically said it all with Protz. I kind of wanted to jump to Ben Merrill. He's one name that sort of jumped off the page for me because of one aspect and one aspect alone, his shooting. Just an incredibly surgical, hard wrist shot that if all the other aspects of his game pan out and he can be serviceable in other ways, that shot is why you're taking him. You know, the Montreal Canadiens need goals, and I think that is absolutely the reason they're taking him. It doesn't hurt either that he's another physical specimen like Protz who will hit hard, who will battle physically. He's 6'4". The thing is, he was playing at St. Sebastian School, a U.S. high school, basically a prep school. So competition was not good. I'll just say it flat out. It was not at the level of college hockey or most of the junior leagues, not even close. And even in there, he was not a point per game. He scored 11 goals in 28 games. So despite the fact that this shot is so good, these other elements of his abilities, his hockey sense being very subpar, his skating being maybe the lowest of anybody that they drafted, his passing only being okay, handling being okay, like those other aspects limited him in a big way. So definitely the Montreal Canadiens think that development is key with Merrill, where rounding out everything else that he's able to do will be conducive to him becoming an NHLer, if he can ever become an NHLer, because if he does, that shot is already above NHL average, which is kind of an amazing thing for a player who is playing at high school. Like in the high school level, your shot is already better than most NHLers. That's kind of an incredible thing.
Yeah, I think also, so he is committed to the BCHL for next season and then Harvard University the year after that. thinking back on some other high school US players, and there is a universe where they can kind of fast track that, and maybe because he was drafted, they can bump him into the university ranks next season. But he's another player where a nice long player development curve might be more than necessary here. As long as if the skating gets even to NHL average, I think you have a player. How much of an NHL player, I don't know, but he makes the NHL, I think, at that point. So
right.
I guess like the only other guy maybe I wanted to touch on quickly, just because he was the next highest pick, it was Logan Sawyer. So him too. This is again this is maybe something we'll touch on at some point in the near future, of more Canadian players opting to not go play in the CHL and rather pursuing the NCAA. So he is doing that. He is I think just a high motor effort winger who I think with, again, him too, like give him a couple years. It's kind of like Luke Tuck, where take your time with him, probably will develop more as a winger than as a center. And you might have an important piece in your depth chart going forward. I really do think of all the players that we've talked about in the day 2 sphere, I think Sawyer probably has the best actual chance of making the Habs as of this very moment, right? Like Koivu's skating can get better, his projectability and eliteness on the offensive end in terms of playmaking could get better. But I think Sawyer of all the players they've drafted, I mean, same goes for Protz, right? If Protz can just get the average on the offensive end, then there's a definite universe where he can become a 5-6.
Yeah.
But I think Sawyer, as it stands at this moment, probably has the best chance of making the league. So that was just one other guy I wanted to highlight before we wrapped. Before we get to the Habs offseason news, because I don't want you to look at Twitter for the next 15 minutes because something big has happened. I want to get your genuine reaction to it. But we'll park it. Let us park it for 5-10 minutes now. Okay. So we wanted to wrap up all our draft coverage with reviewing our top 10 Montreal Canadiens prospects that we did towards the end of the regular season, and to see where and how many of the newest Montreal Canadiens draft players line up in the top 10. So to recap, the top 10 from early April was Lane Hutson at number 1. If I recall, the eligibility for this is if they played in the NHL in the upcoming season, they have to be eligible for the Calder.
Yeah.
Which is essentially the Josh Roy rule, meaning he is indeed eligible for this upcoming season. So number 1 was Lane Hutson. Number 2 was David Reinbacher. Number 3, tightly contested, I believe, Jacob Fowler over Joshua Roy at 4. Owen Beck then at 5. Logan Mailloux at 6, which I think that one, I feel like we're a little bit lower in Mailloux than the general consensus. Adam Engstrom at 7. Jakob Dobes at 8. Philip Machar at 9. Sean Farrell at 10. Okay, so are we just throwing in Ivan Demidov at 1? Is it that quick of a discussion?
Well, we really have to. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. It's not a discussion. He is so clearly let me ask it this way. Does he create his own tier?
Of course. I love Reinbacher. I love Hutson, but there's something special about a future 100-point winger with just ridiculous dangles, incredible hockey sense, somebody who literally has and will change the face of this franchise offensively for a generation. So yes, again, I love you, Reinbacher. I love you, Hutson, but you guys are going to hang out in the next tier because Demidov is that special.
Agreed. So that's our new number 1, bumping everybody further down. Completely unsurprising, by the way. Michael Hage. I'm assuming he's going to enter the top 10. The question is, where? So obviously behind Demidov, I think that's a pretty easy one to make certain of. The Hutson Reinbacher, which I think when we discussed it in April, was like razor thin the difference between the two of them.
I think you had Hutson above Reinbacher. I had Reinbacher above Hutson, and for both of us, we both kind of said like, "Well, we could use yours."
Yeah,
that's how close the ranking was.
Right.
So for sure. So now the question being, does Hage go above them, below them? Because those guys are neck and neck. And I don't know about you. I put Hage in the 4 spot, right behind them, above Roy and Fowler.
Okay, so definitely
in that sort of next tier.
Yes, definitely below Hutson and Reinbacher. There's just a little bit more certainty, especially with Reinbacher at this point.
Yes.
It just depends on the upside with Reinbacher compared to what Hutson can do. I think those two are above. That's totally fine. I agree he's in the group with Fowler and Roy, and it's kind of, how do we discern the difference between those three? Yeah, it's so difficult because Roy's literally played 20 games in the NHL on a top 6 as a top 6 rule. Jacob Fowler had one of the most impressive freshman seasons by a goalie in NCAA history. And now enter Michael Hage into the chat, who is a completely projectable at a minimum middle six center, I think, at this point.
Yes.
So I'm okay with Hage at the 4 spot, like you said, then Fowler at 5 and Roy at 6.
So my reasoning behind it, because Hage and Roy very similar in terms of, I guess, projectability, but Roy has many more years under his belt. And so Hage's ceiling, I think, is still just a touch higher, just a shade higher than Roy's, because he's so young and he has this giant runway, whereas Roy is about to enter his prime in the next couple of years. And so at that point, he'll be who he is. So
yeah,
that's sort of why I put Hage above. It's also because I'm thrilled that we got him at 21. So I'm maybe throwing him a bone in that way because I'm still excited about it. But how incredible is it that in the span of just a few hours, the Montreal Canadiens prospect pool, at the very least, like whether you think Hage is above Juan Fowler or not, either the top 4 or the top 6 prospects in the Montreal Canadiens season has drastically changed, and the number 1 spot has been overtaken with a bullet.
Yeah. So if I'm remembering when we did this exercise last year, Reinbacher shot to number 1, and I think we were debating putting Fowler at around 10. I think that's what we had come
that
to
was
the
the
agreement
start
with.
exactly.
And what's great is Fowler has jumped up the rankings throughout the year, and that's been fantastic news. But you enter in the 2 new picks at number 1 and number 4, and suddenly, especially the forward depth in the prospect pool goes through the roof. So keep going down the list. My last question is there anybody else so that enters the chat, and not necessarily a 2024 draft pick, although I would presume no other 24 draft pick should make the top 10 at this point.
That's correct.
Okay. The only other guy that I'd want to talk about, because he kind of took off after we did our exercise, was Oliver Kapanen.
Yes, absolutely.
We had kind of mentioned him as a, hey, don't forget about him. He's in the just outside the top 10 group. My question to you is, has he jumped into the top 10? So it's Roy's at 6, Owen Beck right now would be 7, Mailloux at 8, Engstrom at 9, Dobish would be 10. Does Kapanen jump any of those guys into the top 10?
I think I'm pretty comfortable putting him in the 10 spot because the more I think about the future depth at center, having both Beck and Kapanen in your bottom 6, at least potentially, is a very comfortable feeling for me. And so I love the idea of putting Kapanen in our top 10 because of that idea of prioritizing center depth and how important that is, and how the Montreal Canadiens have not had that for a very, very long time, and we're starting to. And so I think I'd like to prioritize that. How do you feel about this one? Did he jump into your top 10? Did he jump anybody that he didn't jump for me?
Yeah, I think so. I think it would be like Farrell drops out of the 10, Machar drops out of the 10. Dobish will be holding on to it, but I'm okay. Like Kapanen finished the year very, very strong, so I'm okay putting him in the 10 spot, but it's like the 10 spot every year seems to be like a bunch of players fighting over it. And what's interesting is all these guys are going to be in Laval next year, so
yeah, we'll get a real sort of closed in analysis of they're all in the same team, they're playing the same teams, you know, they're right. Every night who's getting more ice time, who's doing what, so we'll be able to analyze this in more detail.
Right, like depending on what they do with Mailloux, you're going to have your number 6, or so maybe not, no, Roy would be in the NHL, but your number 7 starting with Beck, Mailloux at 8, Engstrom at 9, Kapanen at 10, and if you extended, Dobish at 11, Machar at 12, Farrell at 13. All those guys are going to be in Laval.
Yeah.
So that'll be really fun to take a look at. Okay, so anyone listening to this podcast now is trying to figure out why we haven't talked about this for 40 minutes. We're going to go into the Habs offseason news, which as at the beginning of the episode, I said, hey, like, there's probably not much they're going to do on day one. Brian, the Montreal Canadiens have signed Juraj Slafkovsky to an 8-year extension worth $7.6 million per season. What are your thoughts?
Incredible. Incredible. Are you shitting me?
I am being completely genuine. It has been confirmed by basically every single outlet, including the Montreal Canadiens themselves.
This is real. Oh my God, dude. Best week ever.
Yeah.
Best week ever. I am so thrilled.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so now it's Goulet and Xhekaj. Those are the last 2. But Slafkovsky is done. He's under Suzuki. He's under Caulfield.
Yep.
So
big win.
We were debating whether it would be between 8 and 9, like where it would be in that range, and if he would even ask for more than that. But
I think we were kind of trying to pitch it like start at the Suzuki contract and see what you can do. And they clearly, once they got to noon on Canada Day, were saying, you know, this might have been the first offer they put out. It might have been, maybe it was 7 million, and maybe Slafkamp was asking for 8. And I think it was just very quick work. Like, he clearly wanted to stay. He clearly wants to grow with this team. And Juraj Slafkovsky's now signed for the next 9 seasons.
Unbelievable. That's true, because this doesn't even take effect until next.
Yeah.
So where does that put us? 2033? That year's not even real to me at this point. It doesn't even feel real. It's so far in the future. That's such a good feeling.
Basically signed into perpetuity. Like you said, it's under, and this is the biggest win. They have kept the rookie extension Suzuki cap intact. I don't know who the next player that would like challenge for that. I mean, it would be Demidov, but that's still like, that'd be 3 to 4 years away from now at this point. But crucially, they have kept the Suzuki cap on the rookie extension. To have Suzuki, Caulfield, and Slafkovsky all signed for what is roughly about $22-23 million for the next 6 years, because that's how much longer we have the Nick Suzuki contract for, is a huge win as the team is going to march in it. I mean, it's felt pretty momentous over the past week or so, Brian, right? With like the acquisition of Demidov, with the acquisition of Michael Hage, that it's kind of, okay, they have the forwards now.
Yeah.
Obviously, they probably need 1 or 2 extra guys, and they'll get them through trade and through this and that. But it's been feeling fairly momentous. And suddenly, one of the other big things they need to do this season, which was this offseason, is to lock up Slav. And that's happened. And now they have decided this is the team going forward, which was not a surprising thing, but you still have to execute it. But Slav is now part of the team's long-term future. I think the Suzuki cap is like the biggest one here. They have kept that number. The cap is going to go up, by the way. It's at $88 million this year. When this kicks in, the estimate is the salary cap next season in the 2025-2026 season is going to be about $92 or $93 million. The fact that Juraj Slafkovsky is going to be at $7.5 or $7.6 million.
That's unbelievable.
You're going to have Dvorak come off the books. You're going to have Armia come off the books. You're going to have Savard come off the books. There's going to be a ton of space to play with. There's obviously the 2 bad contracts are still there, but it's okay. They're in great shape. This is a fantastic contract.
So these 3 amazing contracts, plus the Doc and Newhook one, which I'm going to get into the numbers in a second, but just to address what you just said, these 5 great contracts absolutely negate, and even more so than negate, those 2 bad contracts. And we're putting the Armia and Dvorak aside because those are done at the end of this year, right? Those could even be traded within the next week, if not a trade deadline. At some point this season, we might get assets for those 2 guys. But Suzuki, Caulfield, Slafkovsky, our top line for the time being, $23.325 million. That's about a quarter of the current salary and will be basically a quarter of next year's salary cap. That's incredible for your 3 best forwards. And then if you throw in Newhook and Doc, so Newhook at 2.9, Doc at 3.362, you're under 30 million for your 5 best forwards. You're under 31 if you're throwing Roy in there as well, because he's basically the 6th. This is Kent Hughes the best GM that we've seen in our generation? Absolutely. Is he the best GM of all time? There's a conversation. I'm just throwing that out there, Jordan.
I completely agree, Brian. It's a fantastic contract. Just like draft night, this is a move that Kent Hughes has made where there's no notes. It's an A+, right? It's on draft night, they were patient. They were trying to be sneaky about not overplaying their hand and really liking Demidov so no one else jumped ahead of them. Then they moved up draft day to pick up Michael Hage. And now this with the Slafkovsky contract, I mean, this is a really good stretch, 3-4 days. I don't know what else they have in hand. We were supposed to start off this part of the episode with the Kovacevic trade, but it's so irrelevant right now in comparison to the other 3 big moves. If you would have told me on July 1st at 4:10 p.m., the Canadiens would have already drafted Ivan Demidov, drafted Michael Hage, just for fun, draft Aatos Koivu, and then sign Juraj Slafkovsky to what you and I had discussed beforehand as a very fair contract. The maximum amount of years you can sign him to in and around the $7 to $8 million range. Full marks on Kent Hughes. Well done. You do not win the Stanley Cup in July, but you build a team that is ready to do so in 2 or 3 years with small moves throughout multiple off seasons.
Yep, absolutely right. And look, Jordan, like when you compare this contract with some of the contracts that are being given out, like Gensel with Tampa, $9 million. You know, we had talked in the past about the Pierre-Luc Dubois deal at 8.5, just craziness. Like when you look at deals that are in this range, Slafkovsky will be probably without a doubt, maybe barring Quint Hughes, who's at 7.85 million, the best of these players. And I know I'm biased in saying that, but I'm looking at the list right now, and he's on par or better than a lot of them currently at 20 years old. And at 24, when he's not even halfway through this deal, he's going to be better than most, if not all of these guys. And so,
yeah, what you're seeing is in those deals, you're seeing the price of getting to unrestricted free agency. There's a little tax, an extra 15% on it. We did the exercise of like a month or so ago about like what the comparable contracts would be, and they were all, I think, with the exception of Stützle, in the $7 to $8 million range. So this is fair value, but also those were signed 2-3 years ago when the cap was flat. The cap went up $5 million this year, and teams went ballistic in the first couple hours of free agency. The Canadiens were still able to keep Slaf to like away from the argument of like percentage of the cap compared to what Suzuki's was. Like that would have been my argument if I was Slaf's representatives, but didn't matter. They got onto the contract. I think we can move on for now.
Well, but just before we move on, Jordan, the other thing that this does, you mentioned Demidov earlier and how, we've been talking about him like a superstar, like what's he going to make? This is yet another great contract below Suzuki's that's going to influence Demidov's later. And whether Demidov's is actually below Suzuki's or not is not the debate, because his skill level could warrant him being above that pay. It's a few years from now, right? At least 2 or 3, because even if he signs his ELC after this season, it could be 3, if not 4. But by the time that deal gets negotiated, Suzuki's contract is still in the books. So is Caulfield's, and now so is Slafkovsky's. And so this influences the future, not just with Slaf, not just with this top line, but with this new player, Demidov, as well. I am over the moon. This is incredible news. Thank goodness you checked Twitter while we were recording, Jordan, because we would have missed a great one.
Okay, so moving on for now. I guess we can get to the rest of the stuff the Habs have done, which in comparison, it ain't much. But we did have to say goodbye. Jonathan Kovacevic, traded for a 4th-round pick in 2026. It is the best of the Dallas, New Jersey, Winnipeg pick. So a pick in the early hundreds. We talked in the offseason, we've talked for ad nauseum, quite frankly, about how many defensemen have to be traded between now and training camp. You and I said it needs to be at least 2. Well, this is the first one. What did you think about the return? And was this the right player to move?
I have a few thoughts on this. Whether it was the right player to move or not, just look at what hand is on the top of his stick, and that would dictate that no, it's not, because you need to move more lefties than righties. All that being said, this trade is a few things. Number one, it's a great lesson in asset management. You take a guy on waivers, you pick him up for nothing. You get 2 serviceable years from him, 139 games with the Montreal Canadiens. And then at the end of that, you get a 4th-round pick out of it, the best of those 3, as you said. So in terms of asset management, this is like going on Marketplace or some other secondhand thing, picking up something for free, using it like crazy for 2 full years, and then selling it for value when you're done with it. And I know I'm comparing, like, Kovacevic is not a night table or a beanbag chair. Like, he's a person, he's not an object. But you get the idea, right? Like, it's taking something for free, using it like crazy, and then getting something out of it. And while he was here being used like crazy, he was an absolute character player, a gem in terms of his character. He was a young leader for this club, showing what it means to be determined, play night in, night out for basically for your hockey career, right? Coming off of waivers, you got to show every night that you belong there. He never took a night off. He played every shift hard. You never doubted whether he was going to go down to block a shot or not, or go into the boards. And absolutely, he'll surely be missed by the Canadiens and their fans. Definitely an understated presence on the blue line in terms of his contribution, as like he was not flashy. It was very rare that he was flashy, but he always worked very, very hard and played smart on D. And he also scored the funniest goal of the year on the sleeping Tampa Bay Lightning after they thought the whistle had blown. So that was sort of a nice see you later to Kovacevic, a nice moment to end his career with the Montreal Canadiens, at least for the time being. Now, in terms of the value of the pick, it's fine. Right? Like you took nothing, you got a 4th-round pick. That's fine. It's nothing special, but it's good. But I do like the timing of it. It's not next season when the Canadiens are most likely on the fringe, but not necessarily making the playoffs. But it's the year after when hopefully they're competing for the cup. They could need that pick either for a trade deadline acquisition, or they could just simply use it after some of their higher picks have been moved at the trade deadline. So the timing of this pick is what I like rather than the pick itself.
Right. So in the terms of the player itself, I think you said it really well. Kovacevic was the most underrated player on the team over the past 2 seasons, definitely on the defensive end. We were so enamored with Caden Gooley and what he could do, and just struck by Arbor Xhekaj and the toughness and meanness that he brought. And then you had David Savard, who was playing not a flashy game, but like a game you could see. Like it was very much like he was always in the action because they had the hardest competition. And then obviously Mike Matheson doing all the wacky stuff that Mike Matheson tends to do. Kovacevic, meanwhile, was usually on the 3rd pair, usually with Jordan Harris. And they were just solidly like, I think in his 2 years as a Montreal Canadien, Jonathan Kovacevic was something like a plus 12. And I think that just kind of represents like very quietly, he did a really good job on the third pairing. Like you mentioned, he was fighting for his NHL career. He was a rookie last season. Well, 2 seasons ago, right? This was his second season in the NHL, essentially, despite the fact that he was 26, 27 years old. I think he's going to do great in New Jersey, and I think he's going to have a nice little payday waiting for him when he's an unrestricted free agent a year from now. Good on Kovacevic. With the way that New Jersey is kind of approaching their current offseason, like they're obviously positioning themselves to get back into the postseason, and it'd be great to root for him on a postseason run.
And he goes to join Jake Allen, which is kind of nice. They get reunited in New Jersey, so there's a familiar face there. Not that I think Kovacevic would have difficulty making new friends on a new team. Like I said, he's a character guy, a good leader, and I think he'll be well liked there. I do think he's going to get a heck of a lot less playtime because New Jersey's decor, even on the right, is pretty stacked at the moment. But he'll get into some games, he'll help them out, and they're absolutely going to love him there. Why don't we jump to some other offers? I mean, we talked about the big one, the Slafkovsky one, but we could talk also about Xhekaj and Justin Barron being tendered their qualifying offers.
Yep.
And then Matthias Norlinder and Jesse Ylönen were not tendered offers and will be going to free agency. So this is basically exactly what we wanted when we did our offseason preview. So I'm pretty happy with this. Xhekaj and Barron sticking around. That's great news for the young Habs D-core. As for Norlinder and Ylönen, neither really lived up to the expectations, and they'll be moving on. They both got a shot. I'd say Ylönen much more so than Norlinder, but both did have a chance to get their foot in the door and try and be a mainstay, but neither did it. So best of luck to them in the future. But Xhekaj and Justin Barron, you must be happy about this one as well, Jordan.
Yeah, an unsurprising decision to tender both of them. We'll see what happens with their contracts. Barron, I think, is on actually kind of more interesting, I think, than Xhekaj, because Xhekaj, I have no doubt that he'll be back on the team. It just depends on what the contract will be. Barron is a player who I'd be interested to see what the Canadiens think about him long term. He is a right-handed defenseman, and there are precious few on the team and in the organization. You have David Savard, you have Reinbacher and Mailloux, and after Barron, you really don't have much else in the pipeline. So he kind of holds an organizational, like he has some leverage in that capacity. In terms of Norlinder and Ylönen, like it is what it is. It didn't work out for those guys this past season. Should mention that Ylönen has already signed a contract with the Tampa Bay Lightning. It's a 2-way contract, but he is still, that doesn't mean he's not waiver exempt anymore. He is. So I guess he would try to make the team out of camp and potentially get sent down to Syracuse. So
he's got big shoes to fill too, right? Like Stamkos leaves and they sign Ylönen right away. I don't know if that's the main replacement they're envisioning, but woof, big shoes to fill there, Jordan.
I'd certainly, well, you know what? As a Habs fan, I certainly hope they think that's the replacement. I guess the only other thing I'd want to touch on is it seemed like people were a little bummed that the Habs didn't sign David Perron, who went to Ottawa for 2 years at $4 million per season. I like the Canadiens. I can name you right now who the 12 forwards would be on opening night if they'll be healthy, and that in theory would mean that, I mean, Joshua Roy is one of those 12 guys, and Kirby Dach would be, I think, the 13th in that capacity. So I think we're good. I don't think we need another veteran forward when we already have, like, the Habs are paying Josh Anderson and Brendan Gallagher and Yoel Armia and Christian Dvorak. Like, they already have veterans who take up a lot of money that are, if they're not going to provide on the ice, which, like, to be clear, Armia definitely did that last season. Gallagher, to a large extent, did that last season, was not overly consistent. They're also, they're in that role on a rebuilding team to set the tone off the ice and in the room. So I think the Habs already have enough of those guys. Anything else on the Habs front? I want to say one thing about the Marchessault stuff, but do you have anything else?
On the Habs front, I got a couple things. I mean, on the topic of Justin Barron, specifically that right-hand side, I'm wondering where Reinbacher starts the season, because we had talked a while ago that like Lane Hudson and Reinbacher might very well be two of the best defensemen at training camp. And so where do they end up? So those four on the right, Barron, Savard, Reinbacher, and Mailloux. Reinbacher's probably the obvious one to be in Laval just because of his age, but it might not be a deserving thing. So bringing Justin Barron back, I think, gives you a little bit of versatility because he has also shown that he's able to go down to the AHL, keep working hard, kind of like an Armia thing, take it in stride, keep working hard, and then get called back up. So on that front, I think it's quite positive.
The only thing with Barron we have to remember is he is no longer waiver exempt coming into next season.
Very true.
So,
Very
and
true.
I do think he would get snatched up by someone if the Canadiens tried to sneak him to Laval at some point in training camp. So that's the hook this year, right? So Harris, obviously Matheson and Savard, and Barron are the only waiver eligible players on the team. Gouli is technically waiver exempt, but like
though it'll never happen.
He will literally never go there. So those 5 guys, basically, if Barron's staying on the team, there's 5 guys that have locked up a spot. And depending if the Habs want to go with 7 or 8 defensemen, I think the Kovacevic trade, you kind of mentioned it there, it definitely opens the door for Mailloux to start the season in Montreal, which we've discussed, I think at this point is pretty deserved.
That might be the best part of this trade, actually. It's not the fourth. It's not the fact that it's in 2026. It's not the nice asset management. It's really making room for Logan Mailloux.
Yeah.
Who absolutely is ready at this point. And then I think the last... Oh, I got a couple more. The last couple of things I want to talk about. Alex Barré-Boulet signed 1 year, $775,000. He's a 27-year-old, 5'10", left-handed centerman. He's played most of his professional career in the AHL, but he got more of a real shot last year with Tampa Bay. He played close to half their games, 36 games he played. It strikes me as a very simple rocket move where Barré-Boulet will help Laval make a real playoff push this year, and he'll also be there for forward depth in the case of, God forbid, knocking on wood, a bunch of injuries. So he's there for that, so that's great. There's also Alex Burrows, who has left the Montreal Canadiens coaching staff for family reasons. He wants to spend more time at home. He'll still be with the Habs in some capacity, just not behind the bench. So this means that the Canadiens need a new assistant coach, and I have 2 suggestions, not of specific coaches necessarily, but like of what we need.
If you were going to give actual names, I already know the names you're going to give. But yes, what do we actually need?
So what we actually need, number 1 is a power play specialist.
Yeah.
I think that's crucial. And then the second thing we need is a veteran to help Marty. Because Marty's this new coach who a veteran presence could help him. So, I mean, the 2 names you're thinking of are Kovalev and Markov after the Demidov pick.
Mm-hmm.
And absolutely, I thought of those. And I even suggested Markov on X as sort of just a little tweet when I saw that Burrows had gone. Like, Markov would be great. Habs legend. It would be a nice sort of come back into the fold. Bergevin's no longer here to be an ass to you. Absolute power play specialist, like one of the best puck moving defensemen we've ever had, that this organization has ever had. And then he'd be a great Russian mentor for the young Demidov in the future. So I think that Markov is a nice fit. Kovalev could be too, but Markov was the one that jumped into my head most readily.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how they fill that position. A lot of people may have jumped right away to, hey, the power play is going to get a lot better. Just got to remember Martin St. Louis also has a pretty big hand in the power play development over the past couple of years. So
they said it did get better. It wasn't Burrows.
Yeah.
They said it wasn't Burrows. Like when Marty came into the fold, it was mostly Marty. So I'm not saying that Burrows was doing a bad job on the power play. What I'm saying is adding a power play specialist to even help Marty to make it better would be a big step forward, let's say.
Agreed.
And that's basically it, I think, for the Montreal Canadiens stuff. Unless you've been looking at Twitter and something else crazy has come out. You're shaking your head.
No.
So I don't think that it has. Gouli still needs an extension, but to me, there's no rush. I'd rather them deliberate for longer, ink out the right deal, than make the wrong one quickly. So that one to me is sort of fine. They've done the Slaf one today. That might be good for today. You ready to jump to more NHL stuff, or do you have something else on the Canadiens?
No, I think we can maybe do a quick lightning round of NHL-based stuff. Again, I want to start off with the Jonathan Marchessault stuff, because we can get into Sean Monahan, we get into whatever Bergevin's doing in LA right now, and whoever else you want to hit on pretty quickly. I wanted to start off with Marchessault because Jonathan Marchessault signed a 5-year, $5.5 million per year contract with the Nashville Predators. Congratulations to him, well earned. But then, and this is what bothered me, immediately, whether it was Renaud Lavoie or other people at TVA Sport, immediately came out with some reports of, well, Marchessault, really liked what the Canadiens made a push for Marchessault, and they really like, he really liked what they said, but they thought it was a better fit in Nashville, or, they were runner up to Nashville, but it was really close. Like, and enough with this. When a report comes out this quickly, it is, in my opinion, very clearly sent that the Quebecois player didn't want to get blowback for not signing with the Canadiens, so they immediately leak that they were really close to signing with the Habs, but like there was just a deal that was just a little bit better. You know what the better fit was? They probably offered more money, they probably offered more term, and they offered a chance to win a Stanley Cup.
Yeah, of course.
That's probably
in a
what the difference
taxless
was.
state.
In a no tax state, right. So,
and with less scrutiny. He's not going to get questioned at every single play because he is this Quebec-born guy who has to be perfect. Like, yeah, you're
but
exactly
that's fine.
right.
I don't care about his reasons. It's just the reporting of it bothered me. That you had to immediately spin it. It bothered the hell out of me. It's happened forever. I remember Daniel Briere, like years and years ago when he was a free agent in Buffalo, chose Philly over Montreal. He eventually comes to the Habs like 7 years later, and it was kind of a disaster. It's happened forever. Like Quebecois players, when they're free agents, don't want to come to Montreal. It's okay. Like live your own life, but don't start the media outlet stuff.
Yeah.
Within minutes of your deal being announced publicly. It rubbed me the wrong way. Again, like no issue with that being the choice by the player. It's the issue is the media spin.
Go join Brady Shea and Steven Stamkos on other deals that were signed by the Nashville Predators, as well as their already formidable team. Saros signing that deal recently. They have Forsberg. Like, they're going to be a great team. Go do well there, Marchessault. Nothing but goodwill for you, man. I mean, I'm surely going to like him more now that he's a Pred rather than a Golden Knight. So Go for it.
So what else do we got? We can do a few here, lightning round, back and forth. What are the other big moves that happened today, mostly signings, that piqued your interest?
Mostly signings, but one trade piqued my interest, and that's, well, Ottawa, first of all, makes a good trade. One step forward, getting Ullmark, dealing with their goaltending situation, and then takes a massive step back, and goodbye, Jacob Chychrun. What is happening in Ottawa, man? It's one step forward, two steps back, right? Acquiring Ullmark, fixing your goaltending situation, but then getting rid of Chychrun, which messes up your blue line in exchange for Nick Jensen and a 2026 third from the Capital. So like Nick Jensen, he's an okay right-handed defenseman, which they definitely need right-hand Ds, but Chychrun's a better defenseman.
So what happened is most likely Chychrun said he wasn't going to re-sign. When they went to him the moment free agency started, they said, cool, we have this deal in place, goodbye. That's my guess. What the Senators need to learn is they are not a team that should be getting players when they're 22, 23, 24 years old, when they only have a couple years before they reach unrestricted free agency. They need to figure out and plan as if they are a draft-based franchise. You have to acquire guys at 18 and build up through that. Calgary is going through the same stuff right now, although getting Daryl Sutter out of the image, out of the picture might have like clouded some of that. Like it might not totally be Calgary-based, but that's what the Sens need to do. They made the mistake with the DeBrincat. They've made the mistake with Chychrun. They've lost on both ends. They made the mistake. Tarasenko's a little bit different. And then Ullmark, like they better sign him to an extension. Otherwise, it's literally history repeating itself every 12 months.
Yeah.
My turn. Sean Monahan.
Yeah. Great one.
Just awesome. Fantastic. 5 years, $5.5 million a year. Going to Columbus. Columbus eternally determined to build on two timelines and miss the playoffs just for a decade straight. So good for them, but more importantly, good for Sean Monahan. Worked his butt off for the past 2 years to get healthy, had a struggle, came back with the Habs. Nice run with the Jets, and then got paid. So congrats.
Yeah, 100%. Love that one. I have another ex-Hab that we can mention is Tyler Toffoli going to the Sharks. So $24 million over the next 4 seasons, so $6 million a year. That is a very, very nice deal, especially because Celebrini and Smith are going to need some scoring wingers, and Toffoli is exactly that. Still in his prime. I think it's a great fit. They're going to love him as a character guy, and they're going to love him on the ice. So Tyler Toffoli, all the best with San Jose. I think that's going to be a very good fit there.
And in some capacity, he has some type of no trade, no move clause for the first time ever. Pretty smart on Tyler Toffoli's part, a player who was traded despite being a 30-goal scorer consistently.
Yeah.
Getting traded every 9 months. So good for him to get some of that, Northern California vibes and make sure he can get at least control in some part. I haven't seen exactly what the no movement, no trade is, but I would hope it's at least fairly robust. Last one that I have is just good on Marc Bergevin. Joel Edmondson, 4-year contract worth $3.8 million a year. I hope Arbor Jacki doesn't see this contract, because if Edmondson's worth that much money for that many years, what is LA doing, Brian? This is a guy who cannot stay healthy. He was a warrior for the Habs. He was awesome. He did a great job. At one point, I thought he should be the team's captain in kind of like a bridge year before Suzuki was ready. So this is not in any offense to Joel Edmondson. Hell, congrats on the nearly $16 million contract you just signed and living in Southern California.
Enjoy it. Yeah. No, I have 2 words. I have 2 words on this, Jordan. To answer your question of what the heck is going on, Karl Alzner.
Oh, revenge. It just finished. You're right. That's exactly what it is.
Right?
He needed another terrible defenseman contract, and Alzner just wrapped up a day ago.
Where's the extension for Karl Alzner? That should be coming out any minute now. Karl Alzner getting hilarious. Anyway, but the Edmondson deal, It's bad. It's too much money. It's too many years for a guy who, like you said, is perpetually injured. Loved him when he was a Hab, mainstay on the blue line. Part of that, just 4 warriors on the back end going to the Stanley Cup final against Tampa. But now is not the time when you give him that much money or that much term. I have to wonder if there were other offers that were similar, and that's why Bergevin was forced to give that much. But if he was, I would say let him walk and look for somebody else a few days later, and you'll probably find somebody who's going to play more games for you next year.
Anything else, Brian, that you have? I have one more piece of news I want to bring up. It's not player or transaction related. It's more NHL related. But do you have any other player transactions you wanted to bring up?
Just one. About an hour ago, Corey Perry signed his 1-year extension with the Oilers. So I have a prediction about next year's final. The Oilers will lose in the final once again.
I wonder, there's a funny discussion going on online about if the Oilers also signed Jeff Skinner, do they lose in the final or do they not make the playoffs? Because Perry seems to guarantee 3 playoff round victories, but Jeff Skinner seems to guarantee no playoffs.
Interesting.
And I think the conclusion was that Skinner will be healthy the whole season and get injured at the end, not playing in the postseason. Anyways, I hope Jeff Skinner finds a team that actually finally gets into the postseason. Corey Perry to Edmonton. Yeah, sure. That's Corey Perry doing Corey Perry things. Good for him.
Yeah, that was more of an opportunity to make a Corey Perry can't win the Stanley Cup again joke.
I will say it would be funnier if he hadn't actually already won one.
Absolutely. But it makes it so that you don't feel bad making the joke. Because anybody who's like, he's made it so many times, don't make fun of it. He has a ring. You know, he had one with Anaheim. He has a ring. Don't get too upset.
He has an MVP.
Yeah.
He is. I'm pretty sure he has a Rocket Richard trophy. Like, Corey Perry is doing just fine, I promise. So, last thing I wanted to bring up, and I don't know if the NHL thought they could sneak this by or Pierre LeBrun thought they could sneak it by on free agency, but he put out a report early afternoon, right as free agency was kicking off, about the NHL and the NHLPA discussing some scheduling changes that will likely not take part until the new CBA is ratified in 2 years. Essentially, 2 things are being discussed. There's a lot of other jargon he put in there, but essentially it's start and finish the season earlier, which I think is music to so many people's ears. I don't think anyone enjoyed the fact that the Stanley Cup final went all the way to June 24th and that there was like 3 days between that and the draft, and then like 13 hours between the draft ending and free agency starting. So there's a general consensus that start the season earlier in October, make the preseason shorter.
Yeah.
And award the cup, maybe not necessarily end of May, like me, I personally would prefer it, but maybe they're wrapping it up by like June 7th or June 10th. So that was the good part, Brian. Any comments on the good part of this little update?
I got nothing other than, thumbs up. These were decisions that had to be made. I say decisions, they're still in discussions, right? But this is what's being brought forward. So hopefully that it pans out like this. I as well would love to see May 31st as a sort of deadline for the Stanley Cup being given out. But we'll get there maybe one day, but this is a good start to that. So I assume if you started with the good, there's one element that you don't think is so good, something bad. So what is that?
So they want to extend the season from 82 to 84 games, which, yes, it's just 2 more games, but the season is already at least 10 games too long. I hate it. I hate it so much. They made this argument during the season that it's because teams want to play within their division, everybody 4 times. Right now, the way the schedule is made, that is not necessarily capable. I think the Habs and the Leafs only played 3 times this past season. Or it's either the Leafs or the Sens. One of them, they only played 3 times this season. So the other way of doing it is you can cut the season down to 72 games and redistribute some of those games that the Canadiens would play against the Metro Division, like the Penguins and the Flyers, and redistribute those to the teams in the Atlantic. And that way you can still get to it. I think it's either 72 or 76 games. Like, you can reduce the number of games. But of course, less games means less money. And these people always want more money because endless growth is what we all require, apparently, when it comes to capitalism. So, Brian, any thoughts on this? It's just like, it's like the lowest of hanging fruits for the way to NHL to make more money. Like, they clearly want to make more money, and that's cool. There's so many more innovative ways, like, and I'm sorry to bring it up again, the play-in tournament, where they could do this. And instead they're going with the lowest hanging fruit, which is just make the regular season, which is already too long and too much of a slog, longer.
I agree with you. I think it's too much. I mean, the OCD mathematical part of my brain loves the fact that you play every division rival 4 times, everybody in your conference that's not in your division 3 times, and everybody in the other conference 2 times. It's just there's parity there. It makes it fair for everybody. But absolutely, the season's too long. And like you said, there's ways going down to 76, 72, even 68. I think there was a methodology. I remember doing a bunch of these like last year in one of our segments where we looked at different ways that you can improve parity and also decrease the number of games. But that I'm sad to say it'll never happen. Like once they get the taste of a little bit more money, they're certainly not going to reduce the number of games. So I'm kind of ambivalent about this one, to be honest with you, because it was bound to happen.
I just think if the goal is more money, then do the play-in, because that makes everything more exciting.
Yeah. I
Right?
can't debate that.
Adding one home game for every team, sure, it makes more money, but it doesn't make the value of your TV package better. Adding a play-in is a brand new TV package, and that's more money. I'm sure ESPN would bend over backwards, or TNT, or TSN is dying to get back into like the national broadcast sphere. Sportsnet wants to keep that all to themselves. Like,
it's also another whole group of sponsors that are sponsoring every aspect of that specific tournament.
Right. And then crucially, like we're seeing it right now with like Netflix is getting in on the NFL. Amazon is already in on the NFL. Amazon is just getting in on the NBA starting in a year or two. You don't think a streamer wants to get involved in the NHL? Like there's so many, you can make so much more money doing the plan and reducing the number of games than just adding one home game.
Yeah.
It's dumb. Anyways, we've gone really long. Brian, is there anything else you want to say as we wrap up what has been a pretty big roller coaster of an episode?
I want to say thank you for sticking around, those of you who stuck around despite us starting the episode not talking about Slafkovsky. And we got there eventually because we recorded as it came out halfway through.
It's great.
I'm so excited. Slafkovsky is a Hab for 9 more years, guaranteed. The future is bright.
Future is indeed bright. Okay, I'll wrap the episode up here. As mentioned at the beginning of the episode, we'll be back at least one more time before the end of the off season. Likely in a few weeks. I guess at this point, what we're really waiting on is a goalie or Xhekaj contract and maybe a defenseman to be moved. We'll target late July for that episode, but if something else big happens, we'll throw up the bat signal. We'll come back to record emergency style. We'll be here for you in those moments. Thank you to everyone that's listened over the past few weeks. We've put out a ton of content. It seems like people have liked it, and that's fantastic. Thank you for that. And yeah, enjoy the weather. Enjoy July. Until next time, go Habs.